My daughter asked me to watch a movie with her. It was, for the most part, my philosophy on children's movies is that I don't watch them because their whole purpose is to occupy my children in order to allow me to do anything else. So I don't watch them. But in this particular case, I sat down with her. She insisted. She really wanted me to see it. She thought I would like it. It was called Encanto. It's a new Disney movie. And it's cute. It's charming. It's colorful and well done. Narratively, it relied a little heavily on a sort of an arbitrary magical device, but that's fine. It did, though. It was, what was maybe kind of interesting about it is that the real subject of the movie was talent. It was about talent, the nature of talent, how people deal with talents, how talents run in families, how one deals with talentlessness. It was about the madrigals, who were kind of an early 20th century magical realist Colombian Royal Tenenbaums. They're a magical family, and in childhood, each of them receives a special magical gift. One of them controls the weather with her feelings. One of them can cure any illness or injury with her food. Another can hear anything from miles around. Another can shapeshift. Another is prodigiously strong, and so on and so on. Another one is very beautiful and makes flowers bloom. Is her gift. She's sort of the Instagram influencer of the tribe. And it's fine. It deals a little bit with some of the challenges of a talent-centered life. It talks about how when you are very talented and everyone knows you're very, very talented and rewards you for your talents and celebrates you for your talents, there can be some pressure that comes with that blessing. So that's true, and that was fine. There was also, I thought, interestingly, one family member, one madrigal named Bruno. And the refrain of the song about Bruno is, "We don't talk about Bruno." Bruno is the black sheep of the family. He is among all the madrigals who are very prosperous, who are the sort of the aristocracy of the small Colombian town. They are widely admired for their talents. Their lives are all built upon, structured around their talents. Their talents are celebrated and rewarded richly, and they are all pretty healthy, happy, and thriving, except for Bruno. Bruno is the one madrigal whose talent led directly to his alienation from, and eventually his self-imposed exile from, both the madrigal family and the community at large. Bruno spends 10 years living in his own filth, in total solitude, talking with rats and cockroaches, cursed among men and cast out of society because of his talent. Bruno's talent, and especially antisocial magical gift, is telling the future. So he gets blamed for all the bad things that happen. Bruno is also sort of a Cassandra figure. But what I found most striking about this story about talent and about people specifically who have unusual sort of demonstrative, flashy, self-sufficient, attention-getting talents, for these people in particular, they were all very successful. Except for Bruno. There was one of them who was a basket case, who was borderline schizophrenic wreck, played by a very twitchy John Leguizamo. It's a cartoon, but he voices it, and And he's the exception. And, and there's also Mirabelle, who's the main character, and she's not given a talent at birth. And unlike probably the real world Mirabelle, who would have been encouraged nonetheless to express herself with, a series of decreasingly convincing forays into one art form or another, all the while being assured by her family and friends that she simply hasn't found her voice yet or found her medium yet. This Mirabelle was universally acknowledged in childhood to have no talent. and then became quite well adjusted and very sensitive, became a really understanding, compassionate member of the magical family. She, of course, her secret talent is actually revealed to be basically leadership when she, toward the end of the movie, brings everybody together with her rich understanding of human nature and becomes the new Madrigal family matriarch. So Mirabelle does just fine. But, what I told my daughter when she asked me, she said, well, what did you think of Encanto? I said, well, Encanto was great. I thank you for showing it to me. I loved it. I would just like to pitch Disney on a sequel to Encanto set in a parallel universe, a parallel version of this magical realist early 20th century Colombia, and in which it also concerns the Madrigal family. And the main character is also Mirabelle, but instead of there being lots of prosperous Isabelas and Luisas who exercise their talents with relish and, maybe occasional friction, but mostly an unbroken enthusiasm and support from the community and generously rewarded success. Instead of a family of Isabellas and Luisas with one Bruno, mine would be a family just that's all Brunos. It would be one Mirabella who's untalented but well-adjusted, and then 9 Brunos who are all indigent, babbling to themselves, living with roaches and rats, and exercising their talents to their own, to the chagrin of those around them, and to their own increasing alienation and despair. I would call this version Disencanto, and it would end when the last of the Brunos dies of a drug overdose in the magical realist gutter, and Mirabelle starts a nonprofit called We Talk About Bruno, dedicated to raising awareness in the community of the dangers of talent. And I asked my daughter what she thought of my idea of this movie, and she gave me a very patient smile, and she said, "Daddy, I don't think you think that children would really like to watch that movie." And 20 years from now, when I'm living in the gutter and singing songs to my rat and cockroach friends, I will look back on that moment as the very last time my beloved daughter ever asked me to watch a fucking movie. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Oh, my producer has told me to start every show by saying, Slee Rickets, you're listening to Slee Rickets, the number one hostile poetry podcast in the U.S. And then in the note, it says in parenthesis, number 6 overall. So take note. Thank you all for listening. Thank you, especially to those of you who have taken a moment over your holiday break to tell your drunk racist uncle about this podcast that he might find quite appealing. Apparently, this is an odd show today. I promised a better structured episode this week, and promise not fulfilled. But it is, I think it should be somewhat interesting. It's going to come in a couple of different parts. First, I just wanted to say, as I've been thinking a lot lately about lies, and I'm going to come back to this more, I think, in another episode. But, I've been thinking about lies, and sort of specifically lies one tells oneself. And with that in mind, I sat down recently and I reread The Wild Duck by Henrik Ibsen. Great play. I mean, really a beautiful, beautiful play. Ibsen is always terrific on structure. I mean, Hedda Gabler may be zero fun to sit through, but it's just exquisitely put together. So he's always worth reading for that. I mean, he is like one of the majors, one of the greats. But The Wild Duck it's as if he started to write one of his standard didactic plays, and then he got distracted because it doesn't really, it has a villainous industrialist, and it has a sort of a cloudy-headed, silver spoon-fed idealist, and it has a self-centered, negligent father, and it has a drunk, cynical doctor. But somehow all of the warring messages in the play, of all of them, none of them ever quite comes out victorious. They all seem to fall short when faced with this figure that he puts in this play of this 15-year-old girl, Hedvig. And Hedvig she's not saintly, she's not perfect, but she's kind and she's patient and funny, and she desperately loves her mother and father and her grandfather. And also she loves this wounded wild duck. And when put up against the presence of Hedvig, all of the ideals, all of the morals, all of the lessons, all of the conclusions that the older, mostly male, bossy, self-satisfied characters present to one another, all of these sort of crumble next to Hedvig, and finally next to Hedvig's absence. It's a really heartbreaking play, in which, I think because, or at least partly because Ibsen forgot to teach a lesson, he just wrote a gorgeous piece of drama. It is concerned very much with lies. And, with lies we tell each other. There certainly are some deceptions between the characters in the play, but also in a really significant way with the lies we tell ourselves. There is a term that the drunken, cynical doctor uses, Dr. Relling. Relling uses this term life lie, the life lie. And he says, when you take away the life lie of a man, you take away his reason for living. The play is, there's also, Gregor's Werle, who is the snotty idealist in the play. Who has never really had to risk anything in his life. He is very interested in disabusing others of their denial, of their self-deceptions. And he considers this sort of the Lord's work that he's doing, going about correcting people's lies to themselves. In this way, The Wild Duck is very much a kind of a precursor to The Iceman Cometh, the great Eugene O'Neill play that is also concerned with, as Hickey in that play refers to them as pipe dreams, the little stories that the characters tell themselves to keep themselves going in the morning. Though really underneath it all, they know that they're lying to themselves. So the Wild Duck is there is a terrible lie at the center of the story, which is that Hjalmar Ekdal, husband of Gina Ekdal and father of Hedvig, Ekdal. The terrible lie is that he is in fact Hedvig's father, when it turns out her real father, her true father, is the bitter, selfish, joyless, cold-hearted industrialist old Werla. And old Werla impregnated Gina when she was working as his maid, and then he sort of married her off to Hjalmar, who was a conceited young fool who believed that Gina simply was desperate to marry him because she loved him so much, and accepted old Werla's charity in setting him up with a profession because he his whole life had been told he was special. All of his friends had thought he was special. In this way, he's a little bit like the Johann character in Scenes from a Marriage, the old Bergman Scenes from a Marriage. He's sort of anointed, and he's, as we learn over the course of the play, he doesn't even really do the photography job that old Werla set him up with. It's actually Gina and Hedvig that do almost all of the work, while sort of preserving Hjalmar's free time for in order to, so that he can daydream and work on his inventions. So it's a sad story because, of course, Gregor's Werla, old Werla's careless, college-educated, stupid young son, Gregor's, is the one who makes a point of letting Hjalmar know that Gina slept with old Werla, and ultimately that Hedvig is not Hjalmar's daughter. Hjalmar pitches a fit, thrusts Hedvig away from himself, goes on a bender with Dr. Relling, and Gregors convinces Hedvig that the best thing she can do is to shoot her pet duck because it is a symbol for everything that causes Hjalmar pain. Well, Hedvig does him one better, and she shoots herself. And I'd forgotten how the play ends, because, of course, everyone is crushed. Everyone is devastated by Hedvig's death, this sort of beatific, but still quite human figure, this totally innocent girl. I'd forgotten, though, that there's a good beat that comes after that. When Ekdal is in despair, is mourning this terrible loss, and Gina is comforting him, and Relling, the cynical old doctor, who's the one who believes in the life lie, he turns to Werla, to Gregor's Werla, the stupid kid who thought that he was helping everybody out by telling them the truth. Relling turns to Gregor's and he says, you think they're going to live in the truth now? You think they see the truth now, Hjalmar and Gina, and they're just going to live authentically from now on? And Gregor says, well, obviously, how could they not? They've suffered this terrible loss. They've been scared straight. They see the light. And Relling says, no. Just wait 6 months, wait a year. And he'll be giving barstool lectures about his terrible loss and the great burden of paternal love, and he will be wringing sympathy out of everyone around him, and he will have taken on a new role. He may even have woven himself a new life lie, or simply dusted off the old one. The moral, if there is one, isn't necessarily that people should learn the truth about themselves, nor is it that they should be kept in the dark. It does seem to be the case that people, however, don't change. Whatever you do to them, whether you tell them the truth or not, they don't seem to change. Anyway, it's been on my mind, partly because I consider myself, if I'm not a Bruno, I'm a Hjalmar. And I mentioned, by the way, the concept. I asked my wife, the psychiatrist, about the concept of denial recently, and her response was basically to shrug. Denial is not. It sort of doesn't exist in psychiatric circles. She's like, as she said, the term codependent, which is a big term in pop psychology, but among psychiatrists means effectively nothing. Anyway, denial also means nothing apparently to psychiatrists, but it fascinates me. As a lifelong practitioner. I'm always curious about it and whether I can learn a little more. So it is, as I said, I'm going to come back to this question. I have some other things I want to look at, other corners of it I want to investigate. But this week, I'm going to bring you just a very particular slice of this conversation I had. So it is not a conversation about denial. It is actually, strangely for this, poetry podcast, it is a conversation about honestly understanding oneself, about not lying to oneself, about really candidly looking at the place that something like poetry has in your life and making an open-eyed decision about it. So, as I said, I did not plan on sharing this conversation with you. I didn't even plan to record it, but I do all my interviews right now on Zoom until I have a better studio set up here. It's easier to do it over Zoom, and in order to make sure I never lose audio, I have my Zoom settings, my Zoom meeting room set to auto record as soon as I sign in. So I had a conversation with an old friend this week, Jeff Colosino. I went to grad school with him. He got an MFA at Johns Hopkins. Unlike me, I think he got in straight away rather than on the wait list. He's a terrific writer and an even better human being. I lived with him for a couple of years and really enjoyed his company throughout my time in Baltimore. He and I worked on poems side by side for a couple of years and talked about them every day. And after he graduated, Jeff stopped writing. Well, he stopped writing poems. He stopped writing poems and fiction and anything you might call creative writing. And he taught himself to code. And he's now a senior engineer at Amazon. He's doing very well. He lives in Seattle with his brilliant wife, Natalie, who's a philosopher who was patient enough to sit down with me at a bar some years ago and explain the concept of jouissance such that I felt as if I actually understood it, at least at the time. I'd love to get her on the podcast as well at some point. But, Jeff and I were just having a conversation as friends. But about an hour and a half in, he started talking about his experience with poetry in a way that touched on some of the questions that are really at the heart of what I talk about on this podcast. And so after our conversation, or at the end of our conversation, he very generously offered to let me publish this little part of it. Because I was not planning on doing so, the audio is a little muddy. It's not quite of the quality that I normally try to maintain. But it is, I think it's pretty intelligible, and it is certainly worth hearing. It is, I would say it is a pretty good companion piece to an episode of Poetry Says that came out recently that is all about quitting poetry. It's either called Quitting Poetry or On Quitting or something like that. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But that's what Jeff talked about. He talked about not writing poetry, despite being someone who really understands it and loves it and has a great deal of experience with it. He's not quitting as an outsider. He quit as an insider. And sometimes comes back to it. So that's what we talk about. It was a very long conversation, but I'm excerpting here a slice of 20 or 30 minutes that I think are really worth hearing. So this is Jeff Colosino. I don't think he's really on social media because unlike the rest of us, he's got a real fucking career doing real deal work for Amazon, like my fancy sister-in-law. So Godspeed, Jeff. And as I'll say another word late, you'll hear him mention, he and his wife Natalie are any day now expecting their first child. So he mentions that briefly, and I may say one more word about that at the end of the episode. But this is Jeff Colosino. As I said, the audio is a little rougher than usual, but I think you're going to enjoy this one. So I'm curious, I remember you talked a while ago when you were learning to code, which, as I recall, you sort of did. You and my brother actually around the same time kind of taught yourselves to code. And you talked about some of the patterns of thought and problem solving being parallel to poetry. As I'm sure, like as you've done more of it, it's taken on more of a life of its own.
Yeah, it's increasingly less that.
Yeah. Sure.
I think, and I don't know, maybe if I had stuck with poetry longer, I would feel more the same way about poetry. But, I think that, I don't know. I mean, maybe it could be a failure of imagination on my part, to be fair, but like sort of approaching like an asymptote of like how much more I'm discovering every time I sit down to write code. But I'm actually working. I actually just don't write as much code anymore either. Like sort of like moved a little further away from that, and I'm now quite happily working less with code and more with just people. So it's sort of swung the other way. But yeah, I mean, like it doesn't stick quite as much when it feels like you know more, and of like there's not like as much of the treasure map that you haven't walked. And that feels it feels very braggadocious. It's like I've seen everything there is to see and learned everything there is to learn about coding. It's like, no, I definitely haven't, but I'm not driven by the urge to discover new ways to express things sort of at that level.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds very familiar, and I think like partly what you're saying about there's a period of like badness where you're so floundering you can't really do anything, and then there's probably like a sweet spot where you have enough capability, but the chemical reaction is still fresh enough.
Yeah.
It's like, I remember just like chemistry class in high school, like you'd watch the early part of the reaction, and then later there would still be something happening, but it'd be sort of fizzling in a milder way. And I think that there is something like that with.
So the janitor is sweeping away like the volcano that
late in the microwave setting when you're like, oh, there goes another kernel. Like there was still one more left. I do think there's something of that to creativity.
Yeah.
And I think there also are ways to renew that some, but I do think that there are a lot of people who have sort of settled, established careers who sort of just keep like cranking up the microwave again. You're like, whoa, it's done. There's nothing. Got to find something else. Get a new bag. Do something. That is like.
Sure. Try to do the same thing in a different language. There are many different kinds of things that you can try to build when you're programming, and I'm only building a subset of them. And maybe if I branched out into a different area of development other than button you click on a website, like I might find that sense of discovery again too. I don't know, there's also always like when you're working on sort of coding problem, like the kind of problems that we use for like interviews or something like that, right? Where it's like really abstract. There are any number of possible solutions, and we're sort of assessing, like this solution achieves the same result more or less elegantly or more or less efficiently. But also, unlike poetry, there are also solutions that fail. Like, I mean, like there's, like it still has to, there are also, like it has to do the thing, and there's a constraint that like there are, combinations of lines of code I can write that fuck up, that, have defects, that have bugs, that, either, subtly have a problem with them that you don't notice until somebody tries to do a particular thing, or that are just like no complete failure disasters, and there's no pass or fail condition, you know, in the same way for, I mean, I don't know, maybe there is,
Yeah, there are like glitchy things where you can have an accidental double entendre, or like an awkward line break, where you're like, oops, that
yeah.
sounds like vomit now, or um, but I think like probably the most likely result when you have failed solutions or like false combinations is like white noise. It's like, what is this? What?
Yeah.
It's just static. It's just like I don't get it.
Yeah.
But I think a lot, like so much poetry people just expect not to get. Like they expect that result, so that then it's hard to say. And as you're saying with a computer, like computer coding is even more formal than formal verse, in that like, well, the computer didn't understand what you were saying. Like you said to do a thing and it didn't do.
Or you created a situation where like the computer understood it perfectly and did what you said literally, and like a person,
Yeah, you just asked it to
now
do
somebody's dead,
right.
Yeah.
This is the joke about the computer reading the shampoo bottle, right?
I don't know.
Lather, rinse, repeat. This just keeps going forever.
Yeah, exactly.
I actually read a thing by, who was the guy's name? What was the guy? I think it was a guy named Hay, like a computer thinker, philosopher guy. It's called the stamp collecting device. Do you know this?
No, I don't know it.
Basically, he's like, it's a thought experiment to show like possible problems with AI. Basically, he says like,
okay.
It's like you create a code that says like, for a stamp collector. Stamp collector's like, I love stamps. I would love to collect some more stamps. So I'm going to tell this AI to collect some stamps for me. And then it ends up solving problems by like, well, I know what we should really do is we should mortgage your house. And then we should get into like the cocaine trade to get more money to buy more stamps. Then we should end up like burning down forests in order to print more stamps. So we can have, so just like all things turn to stamps.
I love this. I wasn't aware of the stamp collecting device, but clearly somebody took this concept and made it into a game that once we're done talking today, it's a perfect little game. It's a very simple, it's like purely text based. I'll drop it into the Zoom chat, called Universal Paper Clips, and you should read it or play it. I think the genre of game that this is called, and you'll understand why when you play it, is it's a clicker. And you're basically just you're manufacturing paper clips, and you just like increasingly optimize the means by which you manufacture paper clips, and it goes the way that a stamp collecting device might. Hours of fun.
I've been talking to people recently who are like previously like pretty serious poetry world people, Joanna, but like even people sort of more into it than her, who have so totally soured on poetry. I'm curious for you, because you definitely like were you got like full immersion baptism, but you seem to sort of like slip away from it more like peacefully earlier on. Do you ever read it?
Not much.
Yeah.
It's funny, in this whole network of days that led me to reach out to you, one of the things that happened was I talked to my therapist on, and poetry actually came up because it was I just don't touch the stuff for the most. And when I do, I usually reach for something familiar, and B, it takes a little bit of kind of grease to get me there. A little, drinking, or just feeling, like kind of in a more of an emotional state. then I'll reach for a poetry book and I'll flip to like, like a single, a hit,
Yeah.
something
Right.
I know, something I used to, read out loud or, whatever, and I'll let it hit me and I'll read another one and I'll read another one and then I'll lose my focus and I'll put it down. Part of the reason, got me talking about it was because it used to be just like I was saying when we were talking about coding and stuff earlier, is that there was always that sort of like motivation of discovery and everything like that. But like now it's sort of it it feels, and I don't know if this is just like inertia or if there's something bigger going on with it for me, but it feels like it's attached to a place that I don't have access to anymore. And like going there is almost like a little bit transgressive. And I don't mean like a violation. It means like it feels like naughty, or like
Like looking at pictures of
or
family.
indulgent, or and which is not to say that I don't think about it all the time, and it's not to say that I don't, you know, find ways to, try to be lyrical in my, sort of daily shit, and like that I'm not indulgent like when I communicate, at work or with friends or with family or like whoever, like like I've tried to hold on to that. I've tried to hold on to like the pieces of like that were like where there was like my personality and poetry and that middle part of that Venn diagram, it sort of, that still feels there and satisfactory, but I don't think that's been serving me well,
Hmm.
because I think there are rituals missing in my life now. Not even like, like there's a lot of like, I'm grateful for sort of like the richness that I have socially with like the people who are in my life. And they all like, even like they kind of know like, oh yeah, Jeff is or was a poet. Jeff is like, that's, like I carry it around still as like part of my identity. But like, Natalie will also like make a joke, about it sometimes too. A real joke, a joke that warms my heart. That yeah, this guy really pulled like a bait and switch on me. I thought like sort of gonna be like a boho poet type, and he's a tech guy wearing flannel. But yeah, and as I sort of talked about feeling like, oh, like this sense of trepidation whenever I like try to pick up poetry or think about poetry, or it's like, oh, that's because I was either writing it when I was really young and just had started writing poetry like as a teenager, and it's like, oh, then I'm writing something for like poetry night because we had like an event in, Slidell, and I would write poems for that and read them for the people who, came to that, other high school kids, right?
Yeah.
But then, in college it became like, oh, like now it's a thing I do and I'm trying to learn to do better. And then it was like just like straight on that train into grad school,
Right.
and like I finished my thesis and like I was proud of it. It was like not that it was better than somebody else's work or anything like that, but that it was the best stuff that I had ever done.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh shit, like this train track, like just now it hits a cliff, or a tunnel that was painted onto the side of a mountain.
What was the cliff?
I think it was a lot of it. I mean, it's sort of tied to the community, tied to my friends, tied to you and people like you and relationships that I really treasured, and but also, tied to this sort of optimization machine that is like the MFA program, and eventually you can't make the knife any sharper, you have to do things with the knife. And I didn't have anything I wanted to cook. At first, like in the very, very beginning, it was just like, I think just straight burnout.
Yeah.
Talk about my therapist a little bit more. One of the things that I really, we're talking about burnout for a different reason related to work, but burnout isn't the thing that you think it means. Burnout isn't when like you just do something over and over again and you're out of energy and you're tired. Burnout is what happens, is the result when your actions don't align with your values. That's sort of when I look back on it, like, I handed in that thesis, and literally that was the last time I wrote a poem. The last things that I had to write for grad school. I felt like I had permission to not write for the first time, but I had to keep it a secret. You know.
You know the end of Joshua Beckman's "Your Time Has Come," the little tiny one. The last.
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, the last page is, "I wanted to stop writing," and the poem said, "It's a beautiful blue night. Stop writing."
Yeah, and I mean, and yeah, and then there's that, and then there's also just circumstance. There was a thing other than writing to do over and over again, a different thing that was also rewarding. But yeah, like what I'm feeling now though is, especially like sort of with all the kind of like emotional heightenedness of being about to be a dad, it's reflection time and taking inventory time and looking at what's missing time. And I don't know, literally, I said all different versions of this, in my therapy session. And yeah, you can see, so we just put this bookshelf in behind me, and that's my books and Natalie's books kind of all mixed in. I'm sure this would frustrate you. Maybe it wouldn't, but they're arranged by color.
What? Why?
We'll come back to that. Because I have a defense for it. I have a defense for it that maybe you'll like, maybe you'll reject. But like, well, you got poetry back there. Like, go grab one. We're gonna do some exposure therapy right now. Like, go get a book of poems. Like, it's like daring me. It's like, what happens? We're gonna do an experiment.
Yeah.
We're gonna be, And I pulled, I don't have the other two down here, but it's funny that you and JP were talking about Komanyaka, because I hadn't listened to it before, but I pulled this, Dan Kydell, and Lunch Poems, and David Berman's collection, Actual Air. And I was like, okay. He was just like, read one. He wasn't even asking me to read it out loud. But I, like I said, I just kind of flipped to the hits, and I went to the Day Lady Died and Lunch Poems.
Yeah.
And that's just like, here's my fucking day, the poem, and I read it and I read it and I read it, and it connected to, I picked it because it was like another thing we were talking about, was just like sort of how I want, like, one of the things that the pandemic has made hard, and that I'm trying to find other ways to do, like we were talking about, is like explore, just like go on a walkabout, go buy 2 cartons of cigarettes, metaphorically speaking, or whatever. And then I got to the last 4 lines, and I've read this poem dozens of times, and I cried.
Yeah.
I cried because I felt like I felt like the gate kind of opened to like a place that like I wasn't, that had been kicked out of, or kicked myself out of. And maybe that's it. Maybe it was the not the feeling of like, okay, you're good, but the feeling of like, welcome back. But also like those 4 lines, but also everyone and I stopped breathing. So I sort of, and that's like the precipice I'm like kind of dangling on, like today, talking to you.
The precipice of feeling the availability of poetry still there, or
or at least the availability, because even like the availability of trying to write it again,
right,
makes me
I wonder for you, because what you're saying about like having a kind of an initial interest or flirtation or curiosity, and then discovering a knack, and then developing that and sort of beginning to identify with it and sort of, as you said, riding this train of achievement and milestones, college, grad school. There's something automatic to it, and most of the poets I know who've continued writing in a serious way, and this is true for me as well, had some point where they had to sort of stop and rediscover writing, not necessarily in any kind of like magical way or like emotional way, but really to say, like, there's a point at which you like it stops being about trying to demonstrate that you're good at something or do well something that exists, and it becomes about satisfying your own need. Like, there's a thing I need or feel, or there's like a crisis, or there's something going on with me, and this is a way to respond to that. That it becomes more urgent to put down, in words, or find some form for what's ailing you, than it is to do a good job at something in a way that other people will recognize.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like what you're describing is like, it seems like the first half of that process was much of your experience up through grad school, and maybe there's at least a possibility that there could be that kind of turn, whether that's something you pursue or not. Maybe it's that you're in better faith with yourself as a person now, and so if you were to return, it would be a different thing.
Yeah. Or even the notion of like a return is like kind of a false choice for me. I can be that rare bird, like, who is just like a dude who cares about poetry and enjoys poetry and isn't a poet.
Yeah. Well, it's there. I mean, it's a return in the sense that
satisfying.
It's there for you. Like, those lines are no less for you than for anybody. And if you want them, if you know to go look for them, they're there. And that's like they were written with you in mind in some sense. I like
that.
But I'm curious about this thing you said about burnout being, because it's not a way I'd thought about it, but burnout is when your actions are inconsistent with your values.
Or it's the result. It's not like the definition of burnout.
Maybe burnout is like the experience end of that situation.
Or it's just when that disjunction exists, what the machine poops out is burnout,
I'm intrigued by that definition, but I don't think I understand.
Well, my values at the time, like, sort of, it doesn't have to mean like my morals. It doesn't have to mean, it might mean like my value is validation and acceptance. My value is a feedback loop where I get, praise or criticism for doing a good job or a bad job, a split job, and I'm not getting the reward anymore when I pull the lever. I get one marshmallow where I used to get two. And that's also, it's part of just like time, like I was saying, I was in my 20s when like community and acceptance and belonging are so much more important, so much more my motivation.
And it is. I mean, it's so consuming when you are living with and drinking with and sleeping with this little group of people, and all you do and talk about all day is not just poetry, but like largely the poetry you are all writing all the time.
Yeah.
That's so,
or just even the poetry, like kind of like what you and JP were talking about, like the poetry adjacent. The fun conversations that you get to have with like people who think at things from the side, or who, like really just want a rabbit hole on anything you assign them to rabbit hole on.
Right.
And I mean, I feel very, very lucky in a lot of ways, because like I also, I didn't have to keep writing poems to feel like I belonged after that was over.
I mean, you've struck me. I mean, for really the whole time I've known you, but even especially in that period when we were both living in Baltimore and had finished school, you struck me as being like a real art of living guy. Maybe it's just because I'm so much
Really,
I'm so bad at it that I don't
yeah.
that like you're maybe you were just average, but it seemed so extraordinary to me. You're just like good at like like decorating and cooking and listening, like just sort of enjoying living in a way that had an aesthetic sensibility, but was also always grounded in experience and in
Yeah,
enjoyment, like a kind of a rich enjoyment of being.
I'll accept that. Yeah. And poetry and reading poetry and writing poetry and thinking about poetry and thinking about things the way that poets think about things and talking about things the way that poets talk about things. Yeah, that fits so well with that, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe I was learning to be a writer and also learning let's just reduce it to the two things: learning to be a writer and learning to cook, and how to really like care about and think about food at the same time. And one stuck. But yeah, no, I think another, part of it too, like the more I think about it, it wasn't that, like, because I was also surrounded, by people who took, well, not just poetry but writing, like many of the people who were most important to me, wrote fiction instead, and that didn't make a difference. I felt often, not that, like, if I were to admit that, like, I don't want to write anymore,
Right.
that like I would be rejected, but rather because it was something that continued to provide either fulfillment or like, like a car to chase, to these people who took it so seriously, that it would be perceived as like rejecting them,
Oh, I think that's right. I think it's much closer to when you're the first of your friends to quit smoking. And it's like, it's not that everybody else is disappointed in you. It's that they're like suddenly unnerved by being around you.
You're better than us.
Right. Like, no, we are garbage people. We do garbage things. Like,
what do you mean you want to get out of the dumpster that we all live in?
that was my conversation with Jeff. Or it was a portion of my conversation with Jeff. I am planning tentatively to get Jeff back on to talk about Station 11, the HBO series, and maybe the book it's based on. And I seriously would, Jeff, Natalie, if y'all are listening, I would love to get Natalie on as well to talk some philosophy. Let's crack open a Platonic dialogue. Teach me something. I did, just very briefly, I want to read one little poem. This may be overly familiar to a lot of you, but fuck it. It's too fitting not to use. Jeff and Natalie are truly any day now expecting their first child, a little baby girl. So with all of the discussion of hope and emotion and talent and compromise, I figured, what better poem than Born Yesterday by Philip Larkin. This was originally published in his second collection, The Less Deceived, which came out... When did it come out? The Less Deceived was originally published in 1955, and Born Yesterday was written on the occasion of Sally Amos's birth. Sally Amos was the daughter of Kingsley Amos and the sister of Martin Amos, who wrote career change or career turn. Maybe it was called, a story that Brian and I discussed recently about screenwriters and poets. Sally Amos was born in 1954. Larkin was very good friends with Kingsley Amis, Sally's father, and in honor of her birth, he wrote this little poem. It's called Born Yesterday. Tightly folded bud, I have wished you something none of the others would. Not the usual stuff about being beautiful or running off a spring of innocence and love. They will all wish you that. And should it prove possible, well, you're a lucky girl. But if it shouldn't, then may you be ordinary. Have, like other women, an average of talents. Not ugly, not good-looking, nothing uncustomary to pull you off your balance. That unworkable itself stops all the rest from working. In fact, may you be dull, if that is what a skilled, vigilant, flexible, unemphasized, enthralled catching of happiness is called. It's a short poem. It takes the form of the priamel, the old classical form. Not this, not that, but the other. Others say this, some say this, I say that. And I, it is, I think, reading it today, and especially as the father of a couple of girls, who's I'm constantly on guard about praising good looks versus other traits, or praising sweetness, so I sometimes have to remind myself, it's okay to say, to tell my daughters they look pretty. That's not in itself a bad thing. But, one is a little bit more conscientious these days about saying you're very brave, or one should be kind, one should be hardworking or diligent. I should have stick-to-itiveness and not just be pretty and sweet and be agreeable. So, with a 21st century eye, all this talk of beauty being the value or the measure of the girl might feel a little funny. But, I think in fairness to Larkin, he's responding to the kind of blessings and wishes that a girl might well receive in 1954. And if anything, he says, well, enough of all that. People will wish you those things. And hey, there's nothing wrong with being good looking. Should it prove possible for you to be beautiful and run off a spring of innocence and love, well, you're a lucky girl. But he wishes her something else. And, the other voice I hear in this poem, apart from the voice of the family friend or the classical poet making her fine distinction, Sappho saying, some say the heart thrills to this, I say it thrills to the sight of what one loves. In addition to those voices, I hear the voice of the wicked fairy in, or I think in the original, in Grimm's, it's the wicked. They're not fairies; they're wise women. Though translations of those kind of terms can be a little ambiguous. But the wicked fairy in Sleeping Beauty, she says, "Oh, all of these other ladies have given you their blessings already. They've wished you beauty and grace and virtue and charm. How lovely. I'm going to wish you something different." And, Larkin was kind of a wicked fairy as a poet. He was a contrarian. He certainly had a bitter and cutting view of human nature. But here he is maybe as with the wicked fairy, who turns her blessing into a curse, he turns his curse into a blessing. He says, may you be ordinary, and in fact, what I mean by that is, may you be spared the excesses of extraordinary distinctiveness, talent, beauty, greatness, specialness. May you not be special. May you enjoy your freedom from that condition. The poem is broken into two parts. It has irregular rhyme, sort of what I think of as a Verlieb scheme, though the meter is more regular than something like, say, Dover Beach. The rhyme is scattered all throughout the poem, but it's broken into two chunks, which make up sentences, the first being 10 lines, the second being 14. While this doesn't really add up to much of anything in particular, it does somewhat remind me of the imbalance of the sonnet shape, right? Which traditionally is an octave followed by a sestet, a problem followed by a consolation that never quite measures up. And here the consolation, what follows the but, the volta of the second sentence, is bigger, longer, more cumbersome, requires more clarification, but is ultimately better, at least if we believe Larkin. And maybe if we believe Ibsen as well. Maybe this is the kind of blessing Ibsen would himself have wished for Hedvig. I'll just read it one more time and then I will say good night. This is Born Yesterday. It's the dedication underneath it. It says, Born Yesterday for Sally Amos by Philip Larkin. Tightly folded bud, I have wished you something none of the others would. Not the usual stuff about being beautiful or running off a spring of innocence and love. They will all wish you that. And should it prove possible, well, you're a lucky girl. But if it shouldn't, then may you be ordinary. Have, like other women, an average of talents. Not ugly, not good-looking. Nothing uncustomary to pull you off your balance. That unworkable itself stops all the rest from working. In fact, may you be dull, if that is what a skilled, vigilant, flexible, unemphasized, enthralled catching of happiness is called. That was Born Yesterday by Philip Larkin. And this is Slee Ricketts. Thank you all for listening. You can reach me, as always, at sleericketts@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.